I think since the outbreak of the pandemic, we've seen emerging data that show many types of GBV have intensified. And for me, that's one of the key concerns that I have. You know, the increased risk of and severity of violence and the abuse has brought to light the inequalities and the variation of outcomes experienced by women and children within local communities.
We are continuing to have very high levels of demand to access homeless accommodation, but also refuge accommodation, and we must do something about that.
All services are challenged at the moment. There's insufficient funding for our specialist services, but also some of our statutory services are struggling because of lack of capacity, and I think that means that this has an impact on services and the services that we can give to survivors of the gender-based violence.
During the pandemic, what we saw was, essentially the message being that COVID was causing domestic abuse. And, it was so discouraging, I have to say, in part because we've spent a decade trying to get this message ingrained in people's thinking, because if you don't understand what causes domestic abuse, you can't eradicate it.
We're concerned about the ability to reach young women in dangerous situations during periods of lockdown, and also while crisis services are not fully back to face-to-face delivery. We worry about the lack of access to support in physical safe spaces, but also the barriers that may be in place to accessing digital support for those who are digitally excluded, or for those who may be living with perpetrators of abuse and are unable to speak openly about any concerns or safety issues that they may be experiencing.
Poverty, which is often a driver, that those issues were there pre-pandemic, they've been exacerbated by the pandemic, and they continue to be there, and that's impacts on women's mental health, along with the impact that comes from cellular exchange and sex, and there's a lack of support and services for that.
But because of the pandemic, we undertook a regular kind of observation of websites, and the kind of that male sexual entitlement continued throughout the period, and led to men kind of making demands and looking to exploit the vulnerable situation of women throughout the pandemic.
One of the biggest worries for us about the impact of the pandemic is in terms of access to justice for rape survivors. What we know is before the pandemic, there was lengthy delays in the justice system. People were often waiting 2 years for their case to get to court. This has been made much worse by the pandemic and the backlogs in our court system.
Victims don't feel that they're being protected. So they will say to us, well, I reported and thought that the justice system would protect me, but now I feel less than protected.
Criminal processes are one of the ways that men are faced up with their behaviour, and having those criminal processes on hold, particularly once they'd started, potentially allowed men to minimise and as I say, to divert them away from the need to change.
About 45% of the reasons that children are referred to the children's hearing are because of domestic abuse. And that's what concerns me, that we're not getting in there early enough to offer families support so that they can escape their situation and continue to care for their children in the best way possible.
I think going forward, we should work together to make sure there is a physical safe space offered for women, particularly if we do ever go into a further lockdown, and to make sure that is really well advertised and that women would know how to access it.
I guess another real concern of ours is the increase in digital abuse as well, and making sure that we all adapt our services to take that into account and to consider our pathways to support, make sure that there's more than one way to engage with services, and make sure that victims and survivors have got a choice.
BME and Muslim women's lived experience of gender-based violence is pretty much invisible. And I think the only way we can do that is actually address that through collective action, better data recording, but also to make sure that we're embedding equalities in everything that we're doing, whether it's health, whether it's looking at criminal justice. We need to ask ourselves, who are the ones that are still the most marginalised within the community?
As well as hearing voices, we need evidence, comprehensive data sets that provide a true and full picture of what is going on for women and for services, data that shows up all the gaps, all the barriers, all the delays, but also the successful approaches, the excellence that we know is happening in different ways in different parts of the country, especially around joined up multi-agency working, so that we can learn from these in order to replicate and crucially resource good practice nationally.
We need services for people who support people with gender-based violence to be equipped to support people with learning disabilities. We need awareness of the issue, and we need to increase the knowledge and skill base of learning disability organisations on gender-based violence, and we just need change across the system.
I think for me, the biggest challenge is creating a society and an environment where women feel that they can speak up and they can talk about their experience in the early days, as early as possible, and not feel there's going to be judgment or sense of shame as well around them being to blame. And I think the gender inequality is really significant there.
We need a cultural change. That's about challenging male entitlement and male violence. Men are the main part of the problem here, and they're also needed to be part of the solution.
And crucially, it's about ensuring the voices of women with lived experience are partners in meeting the challenge of ensuring access to justice for all women living in Scotland experiencing gender-based violence. We can only achieve this through collective leadership and action.
In the long term, the psychological, the physical, potentially, and the financial impacts that can, have really long-lasting traumatising effects on people over the long term. And it's only through collective action, I think, that we can address that together and say that that is not something that's acceptable in a modern Scotland.